Greetings to all. Our today's guest, Uriel Epstein, the Chief Executive Officer of the Renew Democracy Initiative. Uriel, glad to see you and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Uriel, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy announced last night that he arrived in the U.S. to present to U.S. President Joe Biden the details of his victory plan aimed at ending the Russian invasion, assuring that this fall will be decisive. Would this plan make it clear whether the allies were ready for Ukraine to win or whether the West only wanted to contain Putin? Do you agree that this autumn would determine the future of this war?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think that President Zelensky's plan when he comes to the U.S., well, now that he's in the U.S. rather, is exactly that. It's to try to push the allies, to push the U.S. as the leader of the allies, to determine that our goal is ultimately actually some form of Ukrainian victory, right? Exactly what form that will take is going to, I think, be determined over time. I think it'll be determined by what happens on the battlefield. But I think President Zelensky's goal right now should be in convincing President Biden that there is a clear time-driven priority for him to allow Ukraine to do what it needs to do in order to most improve its position as this war continues. Because one of the things that I think a lot of Americans, and to be quite frank, much of Europe fails to realize is that time is not on our side. I mean, I keep hearing things from our political leaders essentially indicating that we can just keep this as a holding pattern, that we can just keep this as a stalemate. But the truth is that the Ukrainian economy and that the Ukrainian people cannot sustain this indefinitely. We have to enable the Ukrainians to actually push this out of the current situation of stalemate and towards a position where they're moving towards some form of victory. So I think that's going to be the key message that President Zelenskyy will be conveying to Biden. And, well, needless to say, if I were advising the American president, which unfortunately I am not, I would certainly advise him to give President Zelenskyy what he needs to actually make progress on this front.
In your opinion, can Volodymyr Zelenskyy persuade the U.S. and its allies to allow Ukraine to fire the missiles they supplied deep into Russia territory for the first time in the war? For example, the Times writes that the United States and the United Kingdom are likely to give Ukraine permission to use Storm Shadow missiles to strike Russian territory, but this decision may remain a secret to preserve the factor of surprise for the Russian side.
Look, I think it's very clear that the U.S. is driven by some form of fear of escalation, right? I mean, we heard this from this director of the CIA, Bill Burns, in a public hearing, actually, in the UK, where he met with the director of the MI6. And he said that the U.S. was terrified, essentially, of Russian nuclear escalation. Now, this was a huge mistake. It was a huge mistake for a few reasons. First of all, it's a huge mistake because you don't want to tell your enemy what you're afraid of. Having the CIA director come out and publicly say that the U.S. was genuinely afraid of a Russian nuclear strike tells the Russians exactly what we're afraid of, which makes Russian nuclear saber rattling that much more likely, right? I mean, Putin is not an idiot. He understands that if we're afraid of nuclear escalation, then what he's going to do is exactly the thing that we're afraid of. So by essentially saying that, he has made it a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? By saying the thing you're afraid of, you are making that thing that much more likely. So I think we need to set that stage there, that there is a fear of escalation, which President Zelenskyy is going to have to overcome. But I think that the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, where you guys now control roughly, I think, 400 square miles of territory, is an incredible achievement. And it's an important one to prove to America and to our European allies that Russian red lines are not worth the imaginary paper they're written on. Because Putin, even with Ukraine actually controlling a certain amount of Russian territory, of course, did not launch nuclear weapons, right? Which was the thing that we were always afraid of, that if Ukraine were to actually take Russian territory, that would be it. That would be the end and Putin would go nuclear. And of course, that has not happened. So I actually think that when Zelensky meets with President Biden, he's going to have a fair bit of evidence to support his argument that this will not be the thing that actually leads to a nuclear war. So I think on that front, he actually has a very good argument to make. Then I think the other argument he should be making is focusing on President Biden's legacy, right? President Biden is 81 years old. He's got a couple of months left in office, and no matter what happens, he's going to leave, right? Whether the Democrats win and Kamala becomes president, or whether Donald Trump wins and begins to undo everything that President Biden has done, one way or the other, President Biden is out. So these next few months are going to be the thing that determines President Biden's legacy in the history books. And I think that President Zelensky should play on that point, and he should highlight to President Biden how important supporting Ukraine over the course of these next few months would be to how history views President Biden's administration, and not only, of course, President Biden, but also the United States' support for our allies, right? The U.S. as one of the leaders of the free world, and whether or not, quite frankly, we still deserve that title as the leader of the free world.
Uriel, you said about red lines, and even NATO Secretary General does not believe in Putin's red lines regarding Ukraine's long-range strikes on Russia. According to Reuters sources, at the meeting at the White House, Zelensky will push Biden to issue an official invitation to NATO, to Ukraine, and commit to a steady supply of advanced weapons under the Victory Plan. It also provides a clear path to Ukraine's membership in the European Union. Is it possible to receive an invitation from Biden for Ukraine to join NATO before the US president completes his term?
Well, as you know, invitations to NATO cannot come from one member country alone. So the United States by itself, of course, cannot issue that invitation. But what President Biden, of course, can do is he can indicate his public support for Ukraine's inclusion into NATO, and he can push internally within NATO to make that invitation happen. And of course, as the single most powerful member of NATO, the U.S. can play an incredibly important role in this. So I think that that is perfectly possible. I think, of course, as before, Zelensky will have to overcome the reticence and the fear within the Biden administration. But as Secretary General Stoltenberg has pointed out, that this is something that is, Putin's red lines are simply not believable at this point. And therefore, there is nothing stopping us. There should not be anything stopping us from ensuring that Ukraine is able to enter NATO, it is able to get this steady flow of advanced weaponry, and it is ultimately able to get an invitation to the EU, because these are the things that will ultimately prevent war, right? That's the frame that has to be used. People will try to claim that an invitation to NATO is by some measure escalatory, but the truth is it's the exact opposite. It is the thing that will prevent Russia from continuing its imperialist conquest, or its attempt at imperialist conquest in Eastern Europe. It's the thing that will ensure that Russia does not enter Moldova, does not enter other countries of Eastern Europe, and ultimately it's the only thing, in my view, that will ensure Ukraine's security over the long term, and therefore the security of all of Europe over the long term. And it's the thing also, in my view, that is most likely to prevent a third world war, because Putin escalates, right? Putin attacks precisely when he thinks that we, being the free world, are weak, when we are willing to accept his provocations, accept his escalatory actions. And if we allow Ukraine to enter NATO, if we offer Ukraine an invitation to the EU, if we promise Ukraine a steady supply of advanced weaponry, these are the exact things that will show Putin that we are serious and that we are unlikely to be deterred. Therefore, they are the things that are, ironically, to some extent, most likely to prevent future violence and therefore save God knows how many lives.
Well, next about the operation in the Kursk region, it's one of the points of Ukrainians' plan for victory in the war. This was stated by President Volodymyr Zelensky during a press conference within the forum, Ukraine 2024 Independence. What do you think about Kursk region as an element of Ukraine's victory plan?
I think it's critical. I think the goal of Kursk, right, was Ukraine, as far as I can tell, had a few goals with Kursk. First and foremost, right, you wanted to get Russia to refocus its troops away from parts of the east and move them back into Russia. And I would say that this goal was partially successful. It was not entirely successful, as you know, that there's still significant pressure that Ukraine is under in the east. But Russia was forced to move a few thousand troops back into Russian territory. So I think from a military strategic point of view, there was some success, albeit not complete success. Where, in my view, this incursion is most important and most successful is in the political and diplomatic arena. Because, again, Ukraine has proven that Russia's red lines are simply not real, that they're simply not present. And therefore, having that territory that Ukraine has managed to take in Kursk is going to be incredibly important, one, to I think, embolden the allies to continue giving Ukraine, not just continue giving Ukraine, but rather increase their political support for Ukraine, perhaps by finally allowing Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory. Because again, just like from a human point of view, it's a very logical argument. You know, I could totally imagine the scene where Zelenskyy walks into the room with Biden. Biden says, hey, look, we don't want to allow you to strike deep into Russia. And Zelenskyy says, what are you talking about? Our troops are already in Russia and Putin has not launched a nuke. So what are you afraid of? Right? And so I think Zelenskyy's ability to say that today is going to be incredibly important. And of course, last but not least, as this war, God willing, you know, in the future starts to come to some form of conclusion, Ukraine's control of the Kursk region is going to be an incredibly important bargaining chip. And it will hopefully allow Ukraine to return additional territories, back into its sovereign control. So I think from that point of view, Ukraine's incursion into Kursk, although ironically, I think it was likely discouraged by certain Western powers, now that it has been successful, will prove to be a very important component in the sort of ultimate Ukrainian victory plan. So I very much hope that Zelenskyy brings this up with President Biden. I'm certain he will. And I imagine that it should be a fairly compelling argument that should hopefully convince the White House to, perhaps in these last few months of the administration, be a bit more aggressive than it's been willing to be in the past.
According to Zelenskyy's interview for The New Yorker, if U.S. President Joe Biden rejects Volodymyr Zelensky's victory plan, Ukraine will have to continue to live by Plan B. But this terrible conclusion that would mean that America doesn't want a Ukrainian victory. What happens if Biden rejects victory plan?
Well, I don't think that Biden is going to straight up reject President Zelensky's victory plan, right? Like, I just don't think that's particularly likely. The U.S. ultimately, and the Biden administration ultimately, is still supportive of Ukraine, although, of course, we have been unwilling to say the most important words that, I think could have changed the trajectory of the last 3 years, which are very simple. Ukraine must win. Three very, very simple words that it appears we still, over the course of 3 years, have been unwilling to say. And, I was speaking the other day with some, very senior former American military leaders, generals at a very high level, and they made this exact point. And General Hodges has made this point publicly numerous times, that unfortunately this administration has been willing to prevent Ukraine from losing, but hasn't been willing, to say that Ukraine must win. So if President Biden, even after this meeting, is still unwilling to do everything that it takes, I think it's going to be a tough situation, right? I mean, I think you're going to unfortunately see more Ukrainians lose their lives in this war, tragically and in my sense, unnecessarily. You're going to see America, I think, forfeit some of our leadership credentials on the world stage, some of our prestige, some of our influence, some of our power, because ultimately Ukraine's victory is America's victory, and your success is in our national self-interest, right? We're not doing this out of, some sense of goodwill. I mean, yes, of course, morally it's the right thing to do, but what's, perhaps most important for any nation is that our actions be in our own self-interest, and I believe that ensuring a Ukrainian victory is 100% in America's self-interest. And I think communicating that or recommunicating that is going to be important. So I think if President Biden is, for the most part, unmoved by President Zelensky's entreaties, it's going to be difficult. I mean, I think, yes, I think you're going to see this war drag on for a longer period of time. You're going to see American influence in the world continue to decrease. You're going to see Russian influence continue to increase. But here's, the only silver lining here that I can perhaps offer, which is that the fortitude of Ukrainian will to move on, I think that's something that is not to be underestimated. And that's something that I think we can also understand may ultimately move Americans. So even if, let's say, in the next few days, we still don't see the shifts on American policy that we want to see, that doesn't mean we're not going to see those shifts in a few weeks or in a month or in 2 months. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister during World War II, had a great quote that America always does the right thing after it's tried everything else. So I wish that we would do the right thing from the very beginning, but I do still stand by the belief that America will ultimately do the right thing, even if, unfortunately, that thing comes later than we would like.
So, Mr. Epstein, Zelenskyy also intends to present the plan to Congress and the two candidates in the U.S. presidential election, Democrat Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump. Trump has previously criticized U.S. support for Ukraine and spoken highly of Putin, but said he would probably meet Zelenskyy. The ex-president previously flagged his own plan to end the war within 24 hours if re-elected in November, but has not given details. Do you consider the possibility of meeting Trump with Zelenskyy next week? Could this meeting coincide with President Zelenskyy's visit to the U.S. for a speech at the United Nations Security Council session?
Look, President Trump has a real chance of winning the election. Former President Trump has a real chance of winning the election. It's an outcome that we should not underestimate. And therefore, I truly hope that President Zelenskyy is able to meet with President Trump and convey, the criticality, the importance of supporting Ukraine. Now, it's no secret that President Trump is not particularly supportive of Ukraine, and that, his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, has openly said numerous times that he could not care less what happens with Ukraine, one way or the other. These are comments that are easily available publicly, and we can see that the people around Trump often feel similarly. However, there is a battle within the Republican Party where there are still a few Republicans, mind you, I think they are in the minority and they are not the ones with power, but they exist, who are trying to push this in the other direction. Former director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, has put out an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, where he made the argument that President Trump's plan for Ukraine should be to support Ukraine and to actually give it more than what President Biden has done. Now, I remember I was asked, I think on this very network, whether that indicated a shift in President Trump's plan. And of course, my answer back then was that the audience for that op-ed was not really the American public. The audience of that op-ed was one man and one man only. And that man, of course, was Donald Trump. That Mike Pompeo was trying to convince President Trump to change his tune and to be more supportive of Ukraine. So the piece here that I think is really important to understand is Trump is a very malleable guy. He is someone who doesn't have a clear ideology. He is someone who changes his opinion from day to day, from week to week, sometimes from hour to hour. He's someone who, as president, tried to ban TikTok and was prevented from doing so by the courts. And now, when Congress actually passed a law essentially banning TikTok, President Trump has indicated now that he opposes a TikTok ban. And of course, what changed was that Trump met with a billionaire donor who ultimately convinced him to oppose the TikTok ban. So the reason I bring this up is because it is possible that Trump could meet with someone, a Ukrainian or someone else, who could somehow kind of convince Trump that it is in his interest to ultimately support Ukraine, to ultimately not allow Russia to make further gains in Ukraine. That's something that's not impossible, right? Trump is someone who is easy to flatter. It's easy to appeal to his ego. And so perhaps there are people out there who might be in a good position to do so. So I certainly don't want to discount that possibility. But I think we should also be honest with ourselves that if Trump wins this election, it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine. It's going to be a very challenging situation. And there's a very real chance that Trump may just, want to end this as quickly as he can. And of course, the only way to end this in 24 hours is to give Putin most of what he wants. There is no plan, that Trump has that will magically and, secretly end this in 24 hours. That plan does not exist. And so, the only way that Trump can do this is just essentially by saying to most things that Putin demands, okay, fine, here you go, let's just end this thing, which of course means that war will restart in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever, because, Putin it'll never be enough. Right. I mean, we learned this the hard way before World War II, and I really hope that we don't have to learn this again in the 21st century.
U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is ahead of her Republican rival Donald Trump by 5 percentage points. Respondents have become more favorable to her since she became the Democratic presidential candidate, according to an NBC poll. When asked about their attitude toward Harris since she became a candidate, 48% of the 1,000 registered voters surveyed said they had a positive attitude toward her, compared to 32% in July. What about Trump now?
Well, it's a really interesting trajectory, actually. So Vice President Kamala Harris has seen the single biggest shift in public opinion of any presidential candidate ever in the history of this type of polling in the United States. This has literally never happened before in history. It's fascinating to see how differently people view her today than to see how people viewed her just a few months ago. I mean, and quite frankly, I see that opinion in my own personal network. Anecdotally, I see how differently people view her. So, I want to note that this is an incredibly unusual phenomenon that will be fascinating to see how it plays out over the course of these last few weeks before the election. As for President Trump, he is a known quantity. Right? There is no human being on this planet, as far as I can tell, that doesn't know who Donald Trump is. I mean, maybe there's still some untouched tribes left in parts of the Amazon, perhaps, or maybe in parts of Africa who don't know who he is. But for the most part, I imagine he is one of the single most famous individuals in the history of this planet, and therefore people's opinions of him are really unlikely to shift one way or the other. Therefore, and we've seen that in the opinion polling, I think, where kind of those who have a positive view of him continue to have a positive view of him, and there's almost nothing he can say or do that will persuade those people otherwise. And of course, the reverse is also true for those who have a bad opinion of him. But I will note one interesting phenomenon, which is that on the margins among independents, there are small shifts. And those shifts are bad news for Donald Trump. They indicate that the more people ultimately hear him speak, the more they are reminded of the chaos that existed when he was president, right? And when he would make policy by tweet. And, you would wake up in the morning and discover some new thing that was dominating the news cycle. And, meanwhile, of course, the exact opposite has been true of Kamala, where the more people have sort of learned about her, the more she's been out there in public, the more they have come to like her. And so, this trend is going to be interesting to see how it plays out. I don't think rather that it will remain the same over the course of the next month, right? Because Kamala will start doing more interviews. There's going to be more opportunities for direct engagement with voters. And so I think, it'll be interesting to see how people's views of her crystallize. Whereas with Trump, I think you're going to see pretty much more of the same, right? Maybe you'll see a few changes of a percentage point here or a percentage point there, but you're not going to see, a massive change of suddenly people either really love him or suddenly people who used to really love him now really hate him. This is really a kind of, in military terms, we're facing a situation of positional warfare, where we're going to see really minor changes on the margins, which are ultimately going to determine this election.
Mr. Epstein, I also want to talk about military aid for Ukraine, because the Biden administration has requested Congress to include an extension of the Presidential Drawdown Authority (PDA) for sending weapons to Ukraine through 2025 to make approximately $5.8 billion available beyond September 30. That is according to The Hill. How do you think why the Pentagon is unable to provide military aid at this time? Because it lacks the resources to replenish its stockpiles, or something else?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I think first and foremost, yes, I do think that the United States, as with much of Europe, we have been criminally underfunding our internal defense production capabilities. And as a result, there is a shortage of the requisite supplies, right? I mean, we saw a little over a year ago how massive the shortage of 155 artillery shells was and how damaging that was for Ukraine on the battlefield. And today, I think we're seeing a shortage of a number of other items. And of course, that, puts at risk the U.S. ability to replenish our own stocks. So that's, so there is an element of that which I think is true, and I think it's a real problem, and I think it's a testament to the fact that administrations of both parties have been underinvesting in that sort of industrial capability. I think we've had this belief that the wars of the future will be fought only with these incredibly advanced weapons, these incredibly advanced military platforms, et cetera. And of course, what this war has shown us and has, I think, retaught us is just the importance of artillery, the importance of, these old school military methods that are just not going anywhere. And, perhaps they'll be mixed with more advanced, more modern forms of warfare like drones. But the forms of warfare themselves that, we were using since World War II, they haven't really gone anywhere. And so I think that's an important lesson that the United States has learned from this war. And so we are ramping up our domestic defense production. Unfortunately, it's taking a while. It's not happening overnight. So I think that's problem number one. Problem number two, however, is bureaucracy. This is a problem that has been infuriating to me for, since the beginning of this war, that you see so many people, both in Europe and in the United States, treating this like any other problem, where, we can simply maintain our current bureaucratic processes and they will be sufficient to solve the problem at hand. The problem at hand, of course, being Russia's attempt to just dismantle Ukraine as a sovereign entity. And this is not a problem that can be fixed through traditional bureaucratic means. We have to create new policies, new processes internally in order to more quickly provide Ukraine the support that it needs. And so when, your planners at the Pentagon, you are kind of looking at this as you would almost any time in history, and you want to be at 100% supply in, American stocks. You want to be at 100% readiness for everything with respect to sort of, being incredibly secure, incredibly sure that, the supplies that we haven't used in 60 years, we still have them at 100%. And I think today that's simply not realistic, right? I think if we had, invested in our internal defense production, maybe it would be realistic, but we haven't. Therefore, we have to look at the probabilities, right? I mean, the truth is we have built weapons over the course of 60 years, which have literally never seen the light of day. We produced them, we built them, we put them in the desert into storage, and that's where they have stayed for decades. And today, Ukraine needs those weapons. Ukraine will use those weapons for the purpose for which they were built, which was to deter and ultimately to fight Russians trying to attack Europe. That was literally the purpose many of these weapons were built for, and yet we are not allowing these weapons to be used for that purpose by Ukrainians who desperately need to use them. And so I think that this will require a bureaucratic mindset shift in the Pentagon to understand that this is not simply peacetime. This is not a normal period of history. We are in wartime and we are in a crisis, and they have to behave as though we are in a crisis. That's the thing that needs to change. The behavior of our senior Pentagon leaders needs to take into account that these are war times, these are crisis times, and they have to, I think, shift their perspective for how they think about weapons supplies from a peacetime era when we can afford to be, fairly complacent and, feel secure in having 100% supply stocks sitting in the desert in Utah or Nevada or somewhere. And we have to shift to a wartime mindset where we have to be using those supplies more aggressively. We have to be sending them over to Ukraine, and we have to be more aggressively investing to make sure that we can very quickly, within the span of a year, make up for those supplies in the form of additional domestic production.
Mr. Epstein, thank you for this interesting and really very important conversation. Thank you for supporting our country. Guys, subscribe on our YouTube channel, like this video, and see you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.